And welcome, Kyle. Well, good morning, Michelle. Welcome, everyone.
I think, are we still waiting for Kat? So I'm going to give it just another minute. Okay, well, we've got 8:32, so I'm just going to jump in to get us started. Hi, everyone. I'm Dina Dawson. I'm Oregon State Elections Director, and I really want to thank everybody for joining us again today for the second Oregon Motor Voter Rules Advisory Committee meeting. Today, we're going to continue working through the voter registration during covered transactions at the DMV. And now that we've gone over it at a very high level last week, we're going to start digging into it a little bit deeper and tying it to some findings in the Baker-Tilly audit. And so I'd like to, before handing it over to Ann to get us started, I'm going to pass it over to Carol to go over some housekeeping. Carol.
Thanks, Dina. Hi, everyone. Carol, part of our government relations team at the Oregon Secretary of State's office. And I did just want to provide some reminders and logistics. Due to some limitations with our town hall settings, members of the audience can't see what presenters put in this Teams chat. So we are asking that if folks are doing that, they're just aware that or one of our facilitators will just read that out loud for the public. And for that reason, I also wanted to just highlight the one thing we did include in the chat in our last meeting, which was ORS 247.017. And so that ORS refers to the transfer of voter registration materials to the Secretary of State from the Department of Transportation. We also have access to those resources by through our notes if anyone needs them. And a reminder for those that are presenting and for our RAC members here that we are recording and we're also live streaming. And with that, I'll kick us off with introductions. So if folks can just go around and say their name, their role, and the entity you're with, that would be really helpful. So like I said, I'm with the Secretary of State's office, and I'll pass it to you, Michelle.
Good morning. I'm Michelle Godin. I work for DMV as a TSR1. I'm also here as the president of our sublocal for SEIU 503, sublocal 735. I guess, Kyle, you're next.
Sure. Hi, glad to be here. My name is Kyle Yoder. I'm the Associate Research Director at the Center for Election Innovation and Research. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit that helps organizations or helps states and local election officials around the country. I'll pass it off to Tracy.
Good morning. Yes, I am Tracy Provenco, Clatsop County Clerk. I represent the Oregon Association of County Clerks.
Tracy, you went on mute right when you said I'll pass it off to you, but I couldn't read your lips to see who you said.
Ulysses, sorry.
Oh, thank you, Tracy. Hi, good morning, y'all. My name is Ulysses Santiano Claseca. I'm a program coordinator with Innovation Law Lab. Innovation Law Lab, we're big on advocating for immigrant and refugee justice. That's our whole thing.
How about Kat?
Hi, I'm Kat Schwartz. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with ODOT and DMV as the voter registration analyst. And let's see, I'll pass to Vanessa.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Vanessa Campuzano Villalobos. I'm the Constituent Services Specialist here with Oregon Secretary of State. Thanks for being here. Oh, and I'll pass it off to Ann. My bad.
Thanks, Vanessa. Hello, everyone. Good to see you again. My name is Ann Burke-Jones. I'm the Elections Administration Manager with the Secretary of State's Office, Elections Division. I use they, them pronouns. And I think everybody has been introduced this morning that is speaking. So we can continue on. So without repeating everything that Dina said, we're going to stick with voter registration during this meeting, specifically covering voter registration during covered transactions at DMV. So it's a lot of the same material that we covered last week, but how last week we did a really high level view, we're going to try to dig a little bit deeper. We're also going to discuss the Baker-Tilly audit and some recommendations and findings and how those are tied to this particular segment. And then I just wanted to give just a brief overview of the schedule that we have going forward to kind of provide a little extra context as we continue this discussion, just so we can kind of see where we'll talk about other aspects and especially as we dig into the Baker-Tilly findings and recommendations where we will be addressing those later throughout the process. So just a brief overview of the calendar, like we started last week. With voter registration, we're continuing on today and then also next week for the voter registration during covered transactions at DMV. Once we get through that segment next week, we'll spend a week on the transmission, the data transmission between DMV and the Secretary of State's office. And then we have 3 weeks set aside for the OMV data processing that is done at the Secretary of State's office. So this is typically we'll be covering those that are updates. So people that are already registered to vote, how we're treating their data. And then we have a week scheduled for November 3rd to cover the processing of the OMV data at the county level, how we're transferring that data over and what they're doing with it once they're adding those voters to the whether they're adding those voters to the rolls. And then we have 3 weeks left on the schedule in November where we're going to be reviewing the draft rules. So once we've gone through each segment very thoroughly, then we'll go back through at the end, essentially in November, where we'll have rules that we can review as a group, kind of starting all over, saying now that we've had these discussions, we've factored in this feedback, this is what we think the rules will look like, and we'll go through it essentially all over again. We are scheduled right now to meet on November 24th, but based on the schedule, we're thinking we probably won't go that long. So just wanted to bring that forth to people so that they could plan ahead there. Any questions on that overview before we get into the materials today? This is also an opportunity if we have questions for stuff that came up last week, we can bring those up right now as well. Okay, seeing none. Carol, do you mind bringing up the PowerPoint for today? Great. And we can just advance a couple slides and we'll dig into it. So without starting exactly where we were last time, we are going to talk about voter registration during covered transactions. And the place to start is with qualifications. This is the main place that we'll start. And we're going to dig into the findings related to the qualifications, but also we're going to talk about the Baker-Tilly audit because they've done a much deeper dive into the issues that were affecting the Oregon Motor Voter Program. And we're going to talk about specifically the findings and recommendations related to qualifications during voter registration. So if we can move on to the next slide. And I do apologize for the wall of text, but I think it's important just to get us all in the same baseline, so that we're all operating from the same place. So if you bear with me, I will just read this quickly. These are audit conclusions that came out of the Oregon Motor Voter Program audit that was conducted by Baker Tilly. This audit of the OMV program concluded that processes and internal controls have been established around areas of previously identified errors and are generally effective, although some control gaps and exceptions were noted. Controls are in place to ensure the accuracy of voter registration data. However, one unsupported issuance transaction was identified during audit testing. There is a reliance on legacy citizenship records, resulting in potentially inaccurate or unsupported citizenship designations made prior to the strengthened control environment to persist, potentially leading to inaccurate data being transmitted by the OMV program. We did find that the systems and technologies supporting the program are appropriately configured, leverage automation effectively, and are adequately secured to protect voter registration data, with opportunities to improve user access management and oversight. During the audit, key strengths were noted that reflect a commitment to improvement and a proactive approach to program oversight. Program staff consistently exhibit a culture of continuous improvement, often identifying and addressing potential control gaps independently and ahead of audit inquiries. Additionally, the program shows strong legislative awareness, with teams actively monitoring and preparing for changes in state legislation that could impact the OMV program. Collectively, these strengths underscore the program's commitment to accountability, transparency, and ongoing service enhancement. So that was just an overview of audit conclusions that came after Baker Tilly looked at the OMV process as a whole on ODOT side and on the Secretary of State side, and came up with this. So we can go ahead and move to the next slide, because I think it's a little bit more specific on these findings. So some of the findings that they talked about, well, these first two findings are tied directly to the segment that we're talking about, so that's why we wanted to share those this morning. So finding number one, citizenship documentation and verification. For one of the 35 sample transactions that Baker Tilly looked at, records and documentation provided for the audit did not indicate proof documents had been presented by the customer to support U.S. citizenship status. And then finding two, Form 173-DP and Oregon License Issuance and Vehicle Registration Review Controls, while field service admin manual, the report preparation procedures, it's a mouthful, outlines a control requiring the review of Form 173-DP and Oliver entries. It does not require documentation or sign off to evidence that the review was completed. As a result, the audit team was unable to test the operating effectiveness of this control. And then the third one, finding three, policy evaluation and legislative monitoring. One policy was not reviewed within the expected cycle, and there is no formal documentation of the policy review cadence. Legislative updates are monitored for OMV program impact, but there is no centralized tracking for federal legislation. So just on these findings, we'll go over the rest of the findings, but just wanted to highlight that these first two findings were directly tied to the qualification piece at of voters registering to vote at DMV. So we're trying to share these findings, again, just to give us all the same baseline understanding of what was going on. And then we're going to go back and look specifically. We'll go through the same slides we went through yesterday and try to address some of these findings and some of these recommendations. So we'll continue with the rest of the findings. So if we go to the next slide. Finding 4, training policy and administration. While all sampled DMV staff completed required training on time, there is no formal written policy outlining annual training requirements. SOS, Secretary of State, does not administer OMV specific training. Finding 5 was around issue escalation process, that there was no formal centralized process for escalating significant issues or errors within the OMV program to facilitate proper communication and escalation in a timely manner. This is one where I will point out that this, for escalating significant issues or errors, we're going to talk about this when we get into the OMV processing on Secretary of State side. So this will be a finding that we'll address in future weeks. Along with these next three, these are also related to transmission of data between DMV and Secretary of State. So finding number 6, around signature file transfer documentation, that outbound time data for 3 of the 35 signature files could not be verified due to unavailable system records, limiting assurance over timely processing. Finding 7, failure notification tracking. Neither DMV nor SOS maintain formal mechanisms to track and document system-generated failure notifications. 13 of 15 failure notifications provided by SOS were not resolved timely or lack sufficient documentation to confirm resolution. And then finding 8, user and admin access reviews. Formal user access reviews were not part of the OMV system or for administrative users for MOVEit. And then if we can move on to the last one here, this is just, these are the systems that are being referenced. These are systems that were being talked about in the Baker-Tilly audit, and just kind of a brief overview of what those functions are, and then who is in control of those. So we mentioned Oliver, which is the Oregon License Issuance and Vehicle Registration System that's administered by ODOT, and that's the system, that's the point of sale system that processes data for daily DMV credentialed issuance transactions within field offices with automated processes to identify eligible individuals for automatic voter registration through the OMV program. A couple other systems that were mentioned was MOVEit, which is used to secure managed file transfer system, which is a secure managed file transfer system that's used to exchange DMV credential issuance and related OMV program data between DMV and SOS. There's the MOVEit transfer system, which is a component of the MOVEit system, which includes secured FTP site for SOS personnel to access the transferred DMV credentialed issuance and related OMV program data from DMV. And then on the SOS side, there's the Oregon Motor Voter System, the OMV system, and that is an SOS system with automated job processes that help us receive and process the DMV credentialed issuance and related OMV program data. So lots of information to throw at you, but again, we're trying to make sure that we all have the same baseline for looking at what Baker-Tilly did in their audit, and then looking at the current system. It was a lot of findings to read. We'll continue to go through this in detail. So I know that was a lot of information to just read at you. We'll dig into finding number 1 right now. So if you have questions, again, please, we can start addressing them as we go. I will point out that was a little difficult for me to read a lot of those findings, because as the conclusion had said just previously, we have done a lot of work so that is not the current state of the system. That was the state of the system when Baker-Tilly initially started their audit. So just to keep in mind, those findings were not current state, and we've done a lot of work in the meantime. So the point of bringing that up is to start to highlight some of those controls and those changes that DMV, that ODOT and the Secretary of State's office have done to try to strengthen the system. So with all of that baseline laid, we can move on to finding number 1 about the control gap in validating legacy citizenship records. So finding number 1 was the single high risk factor that was identified by Baker-Tilly when evaluating the efficiency, effectiveness, and security of the systems and technology used to manage voter registration data. So again, yeah, the one high risk factor, the criteria for this was according to the OMV program's Field Driver's License Procedure Manual, a C legal presence indicator may only be assigned when a customer presents original or certified documentation proving U.S. citizenship. Examples, U.S. passport, birth certificate, naturalization certificate. The 173DP form must be completed and signed by 2 authorized staff members when verifying identity documents presented by a customer for citizenship designation. So that was the control gap identified by Baker-Tilly. And now we can essentially move on. Yeah, let's go to the next step. I think we'll actually get a little bit more into legacy records. Kat, I see you have your hand up.
Oh yeah, I was just going to give some background on legacy, but I think you're going into it a little bit. But I can add if after we go over this, if we need more context on it.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. So here we'll discuss the criteria that they had used, the cause and effect, and then how we're tying it to the rule to improve our OMB process. So with the I guess I'll just start here. The cause, legacy records, including notation of proof documents establishing citizenship that were from before the implementation of Oliver that were carried forward into Oliver's customer records. ODOT and DMV cannot require information for re-verification of citizenship once it has been established. So Oregon statute ORS 807-040 specifies the required information for issuance transactions and would not allow for additional information beyond what is stated in the statute. So the effect of this, there is a reliance on legacy citizenship records that introduce a risk that inaccurate or unsupportive C citizenship designations may persist in the system. This could result in ineligible individuals being automatically registered to vote and only discovered if or when future transactions reveal non-citizenship status based on documents presented. Out of the 35 sample transactions that Baker Tilly looked at had an unsupported C citizenship designation. Although the number of potentially ineligible individuals being automatically registered to vote is likely too small to affect the outcome of an election, the existence of such cases poses a moderate reputational and compliance risk. It may undermine public trust in the voter registration process and expose the agency to greater scrutiny. Again, these are Baker Tilly's words. And then we'll move on to their recommendation related to this, was to develop and implement a formal plan to address legacy data concerns for automatic voter registration. This plan should incorporate best practices and insights gathered from other AVR leaders from across the country and be developed collaboratively between ODOT and SOS. The plan should assess any changes or restrictions to the types of records shared from DMV to SOS and potential updates needed in Oregon Administrative Rules, the Oregon Motor Voter Registration Manual, the ODOT and SOS Interagency Agreement, and related technology. So that is that's the first finding. We'll go through the second finding here in detail and then get into our discussion. The second finding was lack of evidence for Form 173 DP and Oliver review controls. Baker Tilly found that the risk here was moderate. The criteria outlined according to the Field Service Administrative Manual, OPS 10 procedure. The report person is required to review Form 173 DP and Oliver entries for completeness and accuracy as part of the daily report preparation process. Best practices in internal control design recommend that key review activities be evidenced through sign-off, timestamps, or other documentation to confirm that the control was performed. And then control should be clearly communicated and consistently applied across field offices. The cause, move on. While the OPS 10 procedure outlines a control requiring the review of the Form 173 DP and Oliver entries, it does not require documentation or sign-off evidence that the review was completed. That the effect was without evidence of and accountability for the performance of Form 173 DP and Oliver reviews, there is a risk that these reviews may not be consistently performed, resulting in undetected errors in credentialed issuance or legal presence documentation, potential for inaccurate data being transmitted to the SOS for automated voter registration purposes, affecting the integrity of the OMV program. The lack of documented evidence limits the ability to monitor compliance, perform audits, or take corrective action when issues arise. And that led to recommendations for 2.1, update the OPS procedure to require documented evidence that the Form 173 DP and Oliver reviews were completed and communicate trained staff on this requirement. And then 2.2, consider implementing a periodic quality assurance review to verify that these controls are being performed and documented appropriately. So those were the findings and the recommendations related to qualifications of voters and during covered transactions at DMV. So a lot of information to throw at you, and I'm sure we could use some clarification from DMV on maybe a better definition for that legacy records, and then how those controls have been put into place right now to address those concerns. So I think Carol, I think slide 3 is probably the best one to have up right now, actually, because that's for the Oregon motor voter qualifications. So we're kind of jump back. So now that we've looked at it, we've had kind of a high level overview of the process at DMV, and now we're diving in deep to look at the audit findings, to the potential gaps that they had identified, and then looking at the controls that have been administered, that have been put in place, and discussing those and seeing if we have any further recommendations is, I think, where we're at. So before we actually dig in, questions at this point, is there anything that anybody would like to clarify, ask a question on, get further information? We all have a pretty good understanding of where we're at. Go ahead, Kat.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be more questions, but I'm trying to think of stuff that people often ask about the legacy system. So we updated to the Oliver system in mid 2020. And so essentially before that, we do have scans and documents of information that people brought in, and that's that 173. So it used to be a driver application that you filled out at the DMV, and now we essentially pre-fill it in Oliver and get more information while the customers at the counter that then our field staff enter. So we do have those scans. They just are not readily available in Oliver, but we can look them up. They're like on microfilm and stuff sometimes, so it might take a day or two to locate them, but that's how if we're ever looking into legacy record and we can't see within the current system where their citizenship information came from, we can pull up those scans. So that's a common question we get about legacy and the timing. And then so in 2021, then came the driver licenses for all implementation. So that is when we had a larger drop down of documents available. So that's what initially caused those document entry errors, because it was a really long list of documents. And so we've updated our system, and so it's a little bit just more separated out into the different types of documents. But the Oliver update was really the place where we see a difference in those legacy records, where we have much more information in Oliver. But if a transaction happened before Oliver, we have to dig in a little bit.
Thanks for adding that context, Kat. Michelle?
I just wanted to add and make a clarification with Kat, where she said the driver's license for all. So that means that prior to that, we required proof of citizenship before we could issue. So the list was much smaller, and it was a lot more. That's where the reliance on that C from before, that confidence comes from, is because it was a requirement that in order for you to have an issuance of any kind, you had to have shown citizenship.
Or legal presence.
Legal presence, yeah. Legal presence. Sorry, I apologize for legal presence.
So go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. We have a baseline now, but I think it would be really helpful to understand what a person did prior to 2020 when Oliver was implemented, and 2021, to really understand legacy errors and or legacy records, and be able to promulgate rules that address that. it'd be helpful for us to understand, or I'm assuming for most of the folks on the rec to understand where some of these resources live. So prior to 2021, when the driver license for all bill started, I heard Michelle say that the drop down was smaller, that folks had to verify their legal presence before obtaining a document. So at one point, there was a list of documents that were acceptable to prove your identity that existed here, which is, I'm not sure if it's in pointing to where here is. And then after that existed, after a driver's license for all, the list of documentation or the identification grew. And so the drop down grew, and that potentially led to different errors. What I'm hoping for in the promulgation of these rules is that we can point to in rule where the list of acceptable documentations to prove legal presence lives, and then really get into, where they live, who validates the type of documents that exist in that place, and then how often they're evaluated. And this would specifically, help us ensure that DMV isn't compliant on the documents that are used to identify legal presence. So just getting a better understanding of that as our baseline. These legacy errors exist because prior to the implementation of Oliver in 2020, a person came in to obtain a driver's license, ID, or permit, and they presented a form of acceptable identification to prove legal presence. And at that time, technicians at DMV filled out the 173 DP form. And is it that some of the forms were incorrectly or incompletely filled out that led to some of these?
Go ahead, Michelle.
So prior to Oliver in the legacy, we called it the flying T because that's what the symbol looked like, was a flying T. The customer would fill out an application,
Okay.
not the 173 DP. 173 DP is a newer form within the last couple of year or so. So prior to Oliver, there was a driver application. And in that we would document what was presented for legal presence at the time in the lower bottom portion of it. And we would get a second look at that to make sure that was inaccurate. So we would still have a second check. Another coworker would check and make sure that I'm getting the correct documents. And then Oliver was implemented. That application went away because we were entering it in real time.
Okay.
And we would still get a second check to make sure, but the application itself went away. And it went to the 173 at that point. And the list that grew with the driver's license for all, what was acceptable for issuance that didn't always include documents for legal presence.
Thank you. I hope it isn't making things muddier than what they are, but I think for us to really understand the legacy records and how this high risk finding number one is that there still are the potential for folks to be erroneously registered through the OMV program. I think it's really important on all of us really understanding that so we know how to promulgate rules to address it. It still feels kind of confusing to me, but I think I'll learn with everybody else as we walk through it.
Kat, go ahead.
And as far as where the list of acceptable documents came from, maybe Kat might know that answer a little bit better than I do, as all I can see is the final ruling of what is acceptable or not. So maybe Kat can answer that one.
Yeah, and I'm sure, there's a lot of factors here, so we will definitely still keep digging into it. And coming up, I know when I was first addressing this, it was like just more and more questions kept coming up. But in terms of the legacy records and where there could be an error, is that maybe we had a C indicator for citizen in a 2015 transaction. And then that person didn't come into DMV all these years, but they come in 2021. And so we pull up their record, we see a C, but we don't have that list of documents that we presented or that they presented. So essentially they could just bring their updated driver's license. Maybe they aren't citizens, but we aren't asking them for any new documentation because they don't have to bring it. So we are then transmitting that C into the OMV file, potentially erroneously. So the one that the auditors found, it wasn't an error because we didn't have documentation that showed that the person wasn't a citizen. What we think happened was that they maybe failed one of their tests. And so we didn't keep, our policy is to not keep the document that they filled out if they don't get a credential. So they probably presented their identification at that point, but didn't pass the test. So we didn't keep the application. So that's a scenario. And, what we've been finding is when people come in for Real ID is if we made that mistake in the past, we're finding it out now because they might bring in a permanent resident card. And we say, well, all right, they're probably not citizens if this is a recent document for them. And that's what they're using for Real ID. And we do need to get that third party verified. So it shows that it's active. And we do that with US passports for Real ID as well. So that's when we typically are finding them now, or if people are bringing it in, bringing in other documentations for other reasons. But so the sort of trouble is they don't have to bring it in every time they come to DMV. So we might be stuck with these old C indicators that are wrong and we just wouldn't know. So we're definitely, this conversation is going to help us figure out what's the appropriate thing to do to try to limit those. And, should we consider it a timeline? What is the criteria for us to limit that risk?
Go ahead, Tracy. I see your hands up.
Thank you. Are we going to discuss what qualifies for that proof of citizenship for you guys? Because at one time people were saying the voter registration card would get them what they needed, but it's like, then that ends up in a catch-22 because voter registration needs proof of citizenship and vice versa. Or can they only use that as proof of address?
That's a good question. Yeah.
They can only use their voter registration card as proof of address. It doesn't prove legal presence to us for any type of transaction. That's a misunderstanding.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So to your other question, though, Tracy, that is the intention of this particular discussion, because we're talking about the administrative rules, which currently would say that U.S. citizens are qualified. So how are they proving that? Because one of the issues that Baker Tilly highlighted was the lack of storing some of those documents, those legacy records. So how can we be assured that this program is only including those qualified individuals? So I think that's a good question. Is there a list of approved documentation that ODOT uses that would prove U.S. citizenship? I have a feeling that there is probably adopted by administrative rule, but it's not in our chapter, so I'm not an expert on it. Kat, is that an answer that you would have?
I can provide it. I know it's more than you would think because we accept all the tribal identification as well. And so, you might think it's just a handful, but I think it's something like 18 documents because there's also adoption decrees and all sorts of things that you might not think about, but DMV sees because we see everything. So, most common would be birth certificates, passport or passport card. And yeah, those are the top two really. But yeah, Michelle, are there other ones you can think of that are a little less common? Or certificate of naturalization too. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Certificate of naturalization or certificate of citizenship. Um, those are the big ones. The tribal, but it has to be an federally recognized Oregon tribe. It can't be a document that's from a different state. It has to be an Oregon tribe that's federally recognized. So it's pretty limited on the tribal side. The passport for citizenship for standard issue, I believe, is 5 years. It can't be expired more than 5 years. Birth certificate, it has to be a certified copy or the original. It can't be like a regular Xerox copy. Trying to think of, that's the big ones that we see. I mean, the other stuff I'd have to go through management and make sure that the document is proper and accurate, and we go through a whole length of like making sure. So those are less rare. Those are on the rare side.
Go ahead, Dina.
Thanks. That's the piece that I'm excited to kind of like dig into, right? Is like just even at the end of that, Michelle, you're like, if there were others, we'd have to go to management. Like for a rule, I really would love to be able to point to the list of documents and where they live. If they live in the DMV's administrative rules, if they live in a procedure at DMV, what I'd like us to be able to identify and rule is what that in this version of the OMV program rules is where the documents live. The process related to that, like the TSR technician can receive any of these in the dropdown. If it's questionable, then it gets elevated to a manager or whatever the process is there. And how frequently those are reviewed. Are they reviewed annually? Like in the spirit of us, you know, we inherited a system that's been working for many years, but this is our opportunity to for some rigor on this process and make sure that it's working as it needs to work. That really means that we're answering all of the questions that folks would ask in rule, and it would be a really supportive document for all of us administrators that are using it when we have these questions. So understanding what the list of identification is and adding some transparency around that for folks so they understand, oh, here's the list of documents. It's reviewed annually. If it isn't one of these documents, the TSR, the technician at the DMV, does this next, and here are the controls in place to ensure. So moving forward, I feel like those are the controls that have been put in place. Let's put them in rule. I don't understand those to be able to add them to rule those, so I'm hoping that we can get through that in these next couple of meetings. But implementing this kind of this annual review or making sure that we're staying current, I think is really important in these big, massive programs. Like we need to make sure that we're evaluating them on all sides and making sure that they're being updated as well. So I think having a good understanding of what the LP indicators or the legal presence indicators are is helpful in the OMV program. We've talked about C, but I think that there are other indicators. There's folks that were just unknown. So digging into that a little bit too will be helpful. But I think I still have kind of the unknown that was on my question when I walked in is where these the list of acceptable identification to prove legal presence, where they live and what they are. I think we need to tie that to rule. So looking forward to, however, maybe at next meeting, Kat, if you can share a little bit more about that, or thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I know we have the list documented for sure, but I do want to see, what is it in our rule and does it just live in our procedures, and the list of LP indicators as well. I know they're a little more limited, but we can get them in writing too. But most common, C citizen, P, permanent resident, T for temporary. We have A for American Samoan, U.S. national, and N for unknown. I believe that's all of them.
I agree, Kat. I think off the top of my head, I believe that's all of them.
Okay, so I am hearing an action item identified that we do want the group to be able to point to the list of acceptable identification documents and where that lives, whether that's in a
and you want
field
it
service.
specific. You want it specifically for citizenship, correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Because we want to be able to address that in rule where that lives. If it's adopted by ODOT rules somewhere else, or if it's in a manual, we want to be able to reference what that list is, and then how often it's evaluated. Go ahead, Tina.
Thank you. Before we move on, I jotted down quickly the C, P for permanent resident, T temporary, A American Samoan, N for unknown, which totally threw me off because I assumed it would be a U. So thanks for whoever created that little brain teaser. But the American Samoan and citizen, two separate LP indicators there. Can you help me understand a little bit why there are American Samoans that are citizen? Why the distinction there?
Yeah, so because someone born in American Samoa isn't automatically a citizen, they're US nationals. So they do have a lot of rights, but voting isn't one that's automatically given to them. We distinguish it because we do get American Samoan birth certificates. And so actually previously, prior to, these issues coming up, we did not realize that that was a distinction we needed to be making. And so we created a new LP indicator for that last fall. So essentially with a US or an American Samoan birth certificate, we know they're US nationals, but we don't know if they're US citizens. So we put them into that bucket because we don't want to put them in OMV unless we have proof of citizenship. And so if they have a US passport that can prove citizenship, as long as it doesn't include the language saying essentially this person is a US national and isn't eligible to vote. That is written in the back pages of the older passports, and with newer passports, it's on the front. So our staff are trained to keep an eye out for that, but it is pretty difficult to make sure that we're looking at every passport for that. It's a lot easier with the birth certificates because it says American Samoa. But that's, it's not a super common indicator, a few hundred people probably across the state, but it's important to distinguish until we have the full documentation. But it is something, I want us to make sure we're thinking about not disenfranchising those people if they are citizens and they happen to not bring a document that shows that into DMV. But we only have what they give us, so that's why that distinction is important.
Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, our intention is not to disenfranchise American Samoans from their right to vote if they have it. So we do have the conversation if they are presenting documentation that only supports nationalism and not their citizenship, to find the documents and bring that in.
Great. And I'll just circle back again. One of the reasons that I think it's important for us all to understand what these legal presence indicators are is because it's a data field that's attached to the data that gets transferred from ODOT to SOS. So it's how we identify those folks that are qualified and should be included in the OMV process. And so currently, out of all of those legal presence indicators, only those individuals who have a legal presence indicator of citizenship, C, are those that are being transferred over for the OMV process. So just wanted to kind of tie all that back together to what we're doing. That's why it's important for us to understand how these folks are getting these legal presence indicators attached to their file. Yeah, Michelle.
I wanted to add another document that also presents with a C that it's actually my favorite document. It's a birth abroad document. If you've ever seen one, they're beautiful. I really wish that I was born abroad so I could have one. I can't believe I forgot it. But that is another one that will have an indication of C. That's like for somebody that was born to 2 U.S. citizens, but they were maybe born because of military purposes or they were on vacation. And so birth abroad, and that comes from the federal government as well.
And then I guess I'll just clarify because I think I heard it. I'm pretty sure I heard it, but I imagine it would be good to just hear again. Aside from these individuals having to present the documentation, there is some sort of verification that is also done as well to prove that these are valid certificates or whatever documentation they're presenting.
All right, so it depends on what the document is, depends on if we can send it through like a system. Like if it's a passport, we send it through the SAVE system. That's the passport verification system. Same with passport cards. Birth certificates, we're trained on how to identify if they are like a certified copy, making sure that they're not fraudulent.
And yeah, I guess the distinction for when we're required to run it through verification is for Real ID. We have to do the passport verification, and that's actually, it's another federal system. It's USPBS. And then for the documents like certificate of naturalization or legal permanent resident cards, those will go through SAVE. So they're different systems. They charge us different amounts, but they're both done in the background for us.
All right. Thank you both for adding that clarification. Dina.
Thank you. And still focusing on our citizenship, right? The one high risk finding that was there. Hearing the Kat, you addressed the Real ID process again. That's in the ongoing audit report that DMV is doing monthly. There are legacy issues that are being identified and reported in the report that DMV is doing monthly. And for all of our RAC members, the Real ID requirements are folks are coming in and they have to present this documentation. And this is potentially raising that flag like, oh, there was a C indicator in the past. And this is this is directly speaking to those legacy errors. There's a C indicator, but the document that they're presenting to us today to obtain their Real ID is different or something of the matter. This is highlighting and identifying those legacy errors. But if a person chooses not to get a Real ID and they're just coming in to renew and not presenting proof of identification, that's the point where we're trying to figure out how do we suss out or identify the legacy records where the C legal presence indicator, how do we flush those out? And what kind of a rule could we potentially create that would identify those? So just wanted to identify that piece.
Yeah,
Kat.
that's definitely the concern, is that these are sort of out there in the universe, the wrong designation. Maybe somebody has moved out of state and they come back because we've had OMV almost 10 years now, and so I think the amount of mistakes are going to decrease over time. But we do have those people who maybe haven't been in the OMV file yet, despite that amount of time. Maybe because they're out of state or, didn't have a credential or whatever. So it is definitely a concern that those are still being perpetuated in the OMV system. And, the difficulty is even if we restricted a lot right now, we'll still continue to find those, but it's definitely worth thinking about what information qualifies to be in OMV. And if we want to make a distinction between legacy and not, Real ID, we have this really high confidence because we've done all this verification, including third-party verification. So, I feel like that is a really high level of confidence. And we have always had these systems for double verifying the documents, at least in the office, but they're different processes. So it's worth thinking about what criteria should go into OMB.
I'm actually going to jump in right there because Kat, I think I heard you say that there's a double check in the office now. Is that new? Because I believe that was one of the findings that Baker Tilly had highlighted. So is that a new control that was added for that double check of documents?
Right. Yeah, I think Michelle was talking about this earlier, how even before Oliver, we had the double check in the office. So what happened before was the first field office staff would look at the documents and mark it on the application and in the system. And then a second TSR, that's the field staff, would come over and verify. So they double check that the documents match what we wrote down. They'd initial that they reviewed it. And then those would previously, that information would just go in the OMB file, but now we do a third check. So that is the next morning, usually another staff member will look at the list of 173s, and that's where we document what was brought in and compare it to what we have in Oliver and just double check that it was entered correctly. And it's an opportunity for us to find other little things like typos too, just doing a double check of the data entry. So that third check is the new piece that has been implemented since fall of 2024. And it's nice that it's done in a calmer environment than the field office, which can be very busy and chaotic. So that has been a really helpful check to have. And what Baker Tilly asked us to do was just to give some indication that the check happened, because previously we did it and then kind of filed it away, but now we have the staff initial every document that they reviewed just to show that it did happen and the date.
Thank you for adding that additional context. Go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. The lens I'm using this entire time is what can we add to rule to kind of describe that. And so what I jotted down was that the field tech, the TSR agent, the field technician, I'm standing in front of them as a customer. I present documentation. They key it into the system. And then there's a second person that reviews. Is that second person that's reviewing actually looking at the documentation that I presented with me in front? Yes, I see Michelle's head shaking yes. And so two people review the documentation and say, yep, this is what I believe this is a passport and this is accurate. And the two of us agree, we document and sign off on it. And then the third person outside of the field office is reviewing they're checking off on that two people did it?
So the 173 it includes the type of document they brought in. So it's not like a scan of the document, but if someone brought in a US passport, there's a box to check US passport. Now we write the number of the passport in that field as well. So it's checking that the passport, we got the information we're required to put on that document. And then in the Oliver system that it also matches that. And we have US passport marked. We have the US passport number, the numbers match.
Thank you. And in this situation, the 173 form, a copy of the identification provided is attached with the form? No. Okay.
No, yeah, because that's one of our policy limitations. By statute, we can't retain documents unless it's for a real ID, because the real ID, the federal requirement is that you keep a scanned image of the documents brought in, but we don't have that at the state level because of privacy concerns. So it's something that could be addressed with legislation, but as of right now, we cannot keep scanned documents.
Thank you so much. And in the rural offices where the number of TSRs or field staff are limited, I think I've heard from some of the visits from our counties, that if there's a single individual at the office, like how does that control of having a second person review? Is there a control in place for that as well?
– Actually, I'm working in a one-person office today. So
Oh,
when I'm done with this meeting, I'll open up the office and do that. So if I'm presented with documentation for an issuance that requires the 173 DP, I actually have to complete the 173 and scan that with the documents that I'm using for another field office worker in another office to then pull up and be able to review that. They have to then initial the scanned one, or I do acknowledgement of that, and then I still get a third check happening the next day from another office, not the same person that did the second check. And those initials go on there, and then that is what goes up with our work the next day.
awesome. Thank you so much. I find this, I hope for all of us, all RAC members and the public that are observing this well, it's really helping us understand what the process is. But each time I get more information, I'm like, oh, but then what does that mean? Like what I heard was, if I have documents that require me to fill out a 173 DP, then I attach them. Understanding, like, I'd like to understand more about that 173 DP. It sounds like it's not a form that's used every single time. It's only a form that's used on occasion.
So it is a form that is used to establish their legal presence, right? So like she said earlier, if you have a legacy transaction of a customer that came in and already had a C, they're now not presenting me with anything that would be changing that legal presence from a C. So they're maybe coming in for their driver's license renewal. They're just giving me their current driver's license. I am not affecting that legal presence. So there's not a 173 needed, because I'm just making sure their information is up to date, essentially, and processing through. There's no documents to have a second look at. So that
Thank you.
doesn't. Yeah.
And we also do them if they have a name change, right? Or
Yeah.
like any major change.
Again,
like
that's present.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Not necessarily,
Oh, really?
because it's only if their legal presence is changing.
Oh, okay. I thought
That's
it produced it with a name change. Okay.
It would produce it if I was taking in other types of documentation that would require a cover sheet. Anything that's required for us to have a cover sheet, we create the 173 for. But in general, the cover sheets are created when legal presence is updated, changed, or created. So that's when the 173 is needed.
Thank you so much for digging into that. And I think we stated on the record last week that we were going to have a demo today, and that didn't end up working out. But so for the RAC members that are on the call and the public, what I'm trying to get us to is a place where we understand what's happening when a customer or a qualified individual shows up at the DMV and is pulled into the OMV process. And it's really technical, complicated work. So the goal of getting all of these questions answers is to really kind of understand what that process is and what the technical process at the DMV is when a person is coming in. It's still a bit confusing of exactly what is happening, and I'm looking forward to how we can tie some of the information that we're learning to administrative rule and not identify and rule exactly what has to happen at the DMV, but the high level, what is happening, so that we can build in some control. So for RAC members that are participating and listening in on Oregon's process, is there anything that about this, or any questions that this highlighting for folks, or thoughts or ideas? Or are we just confusing the heck out of everybody with these highly technical processes? I was kind of hoping to hear from a couple of our other folks besides us technical folks at the SOS or the DMV. Nope, nobody coming off of mute.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm following the conversation so far. I don't have anything to contribute. I just thought I'd come on camera and say as much. So
thank you. I greatly appreciate that.
So just kind of going off on that, Dina, I think looking at the rules that we have, since that's the purpose of what we're trying to do, is figure out how we're incorporating this into rules. There was a line in the OMB manual right now that's in this voter qualification section. It lists U.S. citizen, at least 16 years old, an Oregon residence, and then a line that says only an individual with a record of proving documentation to DMV establishing that the individual is a U.S. citizen will be registered through the Oregon motor voter process. I would think that sentence on its own might not be what we want, because it sounds like we also want to specifically point to what type of documentation they need to present. But I think I'm throwing that out there as a question to the RAC members. Is that the track that you all are hearing, that would help give you confidence that only those qualified individuals are being included in that file? If we include that in the rule, that they do have to have a record of presenting a list of acceptable documents to DMV during their transaction. Yeah, go ahead, Michelle.
My only concern with that is it's a pretty comprehensive list, and sometimes too much information is just that. It's too much information for somebody to understand that isn't in the realm of like what makes the difference between a legal presence and citizen. And that's my only concern. And then having to continuously update that if there's bound to be documents that change or is created, like the American Samoa documentation. We've also had issues with documents from like Puerto Rico. So like some of the documents from Puerto Rico are accepted while others are not, depending, like it gets really confusing. Not that creates citizenship, but it creates like what we can accept versus not, and that list can get pretty extensive. So that's what my concern is just if that list is long and extensive, how for somebody that's not trained in that, how that would go over with the general public.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think that's one of the particular reasons that we wanted to be able to refer to an existing list instead of maintaining a separate list in this rule. So like ideally we could point to another administrative rule which has the list of documents, or reference the service or your field service manual that would have them. Because I agree, we still want to maintain some sort of flexibility. As things change, they can be updated. Any other questions or comments on this qualifications piece right now? I think we can, I would say around citizenship. Let's frame it around citizenship for this particular moment. because then we can move on to residence address and legal presence as well. So anything else on the citizenship documents? Okay. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, I was looking it up. So on our website, our public website, there is a list of proof of lawful status for non-real ID and real ID. It's pretty short, but that doesn't just show citizenship, it shows legal presence. Trying to see if there's one that's just specific to, I'm not showing one that is just specific to citizenship. It's like 15 documents that we can accept for proof of lawful status. So that is, a place that we could try to refer to in that rule for the list. And we can even go and look at that if you guys wanted to. That's on our public website, so.
I appreciate that. I think the one thing that we would like to be able to point to is more of the authoritative documents, whereas the website can be updated fairly quickly and changed. We're looking for the things that have been adopted and have a formal evaluation and approval process.
Gotcha.
So let's see. Do we want to move on to residents? Because I think as we're also talking about qualifications, one of the other issues is residence, and specifically the residence address. So I'm sure that Tracy is curious about this as the county clerk representative with us, but I would like to touch on a little bit of what the verification is for residence address for those customers that are doing qualified or covered transactions at DMV. Is that something that either of you, Kat or Michelle, would be comfortable speaking to?
Yeah, so proof of residential address is pretty straightforward. It's mail that's come to your physical address through the U.S. Postal Service. If we're doing real ID, we need 2 coming from 2 different businesses. It's like a utility bill that in your name with your physical address listed. So you can have a PO box and it gets mailed to the PO box, but it'll show the service address of the physical address that you're residing in. Your voter registration card. So if you've already updated it for your voter registration, that's one thing that we can accept. Your rental agreement, mortgage statement. We can take a verbal of that if somebody can show that they reside there. So if they have an already issued Oregon driver's license with their physical address on it, stating that yes, this person lives with me. So like their 14-year-old child lives with them. Yes, mom says that she lives with them. That's a verbal that we can accept. For real ID, that turns into an affidavit. They actually have to sign an affidavit stating that they reside with them. That person does have to show proof that they reside there. So it's kind of a secondary proof, I guess. That's pretty much it. So it's got to come from a verifiable business if it's mail, utility bill, mortgage statement, rental agreement. It has to have your name with the physical address on it. If you have an apartment, it has to list the apartment, or if you're in a space, it has to list the space.
Thank you for providing that information. Any questions, feedback? Go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. Similar to the list of where these live, to tie it to rule, it would be helpful to have your resource Michelle, like where are you getting this information to? So if it's in the field manual or what these processes are, that's what I would love to tie to. So to prove you're an Oregon resident through the DMV and the OMB process, here are the requirements. And just like you mentioned earlier, it might be like really deep if we were to include that here, but just to reference where that material lives, that would
Yeah.
be great.
One other piece was the determination of homelessness form that we have, the DOH form, and that's what we call it. That means that somebody that works within an approved agency is verifying that somebody resides in Oregon and gives us either a physical or a descriptive address. And we accept that as well. Kat, is there anything I'm missing? Yeah.
I think so. Just we do require a mailing address with those determination of homelessness, right?
Yeah. If they're giving us a descriptive address, then we need to know where they're receiving their mail.
And does that descriptive address get listed on their
Yes.
in their file?
Yes.
I guess I can throw in some situations where this gets murky because I've talked with clerks about it, is when someone updates their own address incorrectly in some way, either directly or indirectly, maybe with vehicle registration. So maybe they don't realize they're changing their residence address. Maybe they're thinking, oh, I want to receive my stickers for my car here, so I'll put this address, not realizing that we do give them options for all those things. They can put their vehicle at a separate address than their residence. They can have a mailing address that's separate, but that's not always obvious to them. Or maybe if they're in the field, maybe they forget to clarify with the field staff about mailing versus residence. So that does cause issues for clerks sometimes when, they can't receive mail and they get all these ballots back, and they can identify that they got the address from DMV. So acknowledging that, and if there's anything we want to think through right now together.
I did want to acknowledge that we only require proof of residential address when we're doing an original issuance or a renewal. So if they're doing a replacement, we're not requiring them to show proof of that address. Once we're entering it into the system, though, there is a bit of verification with U.S. Postal Service to make sure that it is a valid address of some type. That does get overridden for descriptive, obviously, because it's not an actual physical address, but there is some verification through U.S. Postal Service to verify that it's a valid address.
Okay, so I have a question after hearing you say that. So it sounds like during the covered transactions, so when it's an issuance, new renewal, those are two of the covered transactions where you are requiring proof. But if someone's doing a replacement,
right,
or outside of an issuance, if they're just updating their address,
right,
then there's no separate requirement on verification of that address under those circumstances.
Correct.
Okay. Because I guess our discussion is kind of veering a little bit to the address changes and address updates, which is appropriate. That's voter registration that happens with help at DMV, and I think that's important for our local election officials to understand is how that data is getting promulgated down to them. So no verification on updates. And from our discussion last week, David Becker had offered like the best practices were to not include vehicle registration information as well. So I guess if we could maybe look at that address updates again, high level, because that's a little bit of a different process, that it's still data that's transferred from DMV to the Secretary of State's office, but it's not the automatic voter registration process. That's the OMB system. It's not registering people to vote and offering them an opt-out. This is just, it's when folks at DMV are updating their addresses. DMV updates their file, obviously, and then sends all of that information to the Secretary of State's office. And then we look at that file, we see that somebody's already registered, and there's a change in that address, so then we update their address. That's typically the way that process works. I guess where my brain is wandering here is well, I guess with the you said that there's some extra verification through United States Postal Service. Is that CAS verification? Do you know, or is that looking at like the National Change of Address list? I'm a little
No.
curious. Is it just looking for like a valid?
It's just
Valid
looking for
mailing
that.
address?
We're using the Postal Service's database to verify that is a physical address. Not that it's specifically theirs, but it is a physical address. So if they're trying to give us a fictitious address as a residential address, it'll pop up. If they're trying to use like the physical address of a post office, which they try to do, it'll notify us that that's actually a post office and not a resident, a place to receive mail, or like a Dropbox location. But that again is only done when we're doing those specific types of issuances. We will update the system for their vehicle transactions as well. So if they've purchased a new vehicle, said that they've moved, now we're updating their address so that they can receive their title. Dealerships have the ability to give us a new address when they're processing a transaction, which updates their address. So we're not the only source of the address change in the field office.
Go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. For me also, I'm thinking through like, okay, what can we do? What can we do to alert voters that are or registrants that are already registered to vote and they've either are purchasing a car or they're going online to update their address, and maybe they're updating their address just because they want their tags, using that example, Michelle, that you shared. I just want my tags sent to my mom and dad's house instead of my house. If there's an opportunity to use pop-up messages or educate folks on, hey, you just updated your address to here, your ballots will also be delivered there. And, ballots are not forwardable by mail. I know people, that's a lot of information, but the same with vehicle transactions. If we're thinking of this and through all of the systems where data that's being collected is going into the voter registration stream in the process, and probably other places, I don't know where else DMV data is shared. What other areas is an address change affecting for a person that's interacting with the DMV? I'm referring back to what David Becker said at our meeting last week too. Like, DMV is the source. Everyone interacts with the DMV for all of these reasons without knowing exactly what that one interaction, where that data is going or where that's ending up. So thinking through, is there anything on the DMV side where we can do some sort of a pop-up? If it's a vehicle, I can't even imagine doing some sort of education or outreach with dealerships to say, hey, when you're doing the paperwork for a person that's buying a vehicle, did you know that the information that they're filling out on their form is actually affecting their voter registration and where they're getting a ballot mailed? Probably not. I mean, and the importance of that. So there's a lot of systems that we would need to address to ensure that address updates are accurate. But what's ending up happening is that that knowledge isn't there. A person is choosing an address for whatever reason. It's being updated through the OMV process. Local election officials are mailing a form, a notice by forwardable mail that might come back as undeliverable, which inactivates their record and means that they're not getting a ballot, and then they're going. So it's just really interesting to think about for this group and this RAC. And as we're promulgating these rules, what does each of those changes, what's the effect of that? And what kind of supports can we put in place or guardrails to make sure that that isn't happening maybe it's easy to put a pop-up on when somebody is going online to change their address. Did you know that this is where your ballots are going to be mailed? And I don't even know, like, I'm thinking about it from voter registration purposes, but where else does that information go? Anyway, thank you.
So one thing I do want to say, in the instance of somebody wants to get their tags at their mom's house because they're visiting, we do have the option for them to type in a one-time address. So like, I'm just visiting, I just want to change it to moving to here, right? Like, I'm not changing my physical address. That is an option for somebody. Same with the title transaction. Same with the dealership. So we do have that one-time address availability that doesn't change their permanent residence, which wouldn't affect their Oregon Motor Voter and the elections department's mailing address or physical address or mailing. But again, that's up to the customer to tell us, right? The citizen has to tell us that, hey, I'm not actually living there. I'm just visiting. That's going to be the most convenient time at this moment. But I don't know how you can give that information preemptively to somebody.
It makes me wonder if maybe through some through some partnerships we were able to like some election focused nonprofit third party groups that could look at the form to say, is there anything we can do with the language that would help folks understand what does it mean when you're doing this one time address? And I'm not sure. You know, without seeing, I'm a visual learner myself. So without seeing the form in front of me, I'm sure if we were looking at the form together, we'd all be like, oh, you know, it would be helpful if it said this. And as this is a system of OMV and voter registration, I think it would be helpful if we were able to review the forms and I'm not, anyway, I think that would be really helpful for us to be able to view maybe even just a screenshot of what a voter is seeing or what a person is seeing as they're going down that path to update their address, what the page looks like, what the fields look like, what the information looks like. Thank you.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. Do we have to include automobile transactions? Because that's where we run into problems. People want to register their vehicle out here because it's out of DEQ. So they register it at their vacation home or at a parent's home, but they haven't moved. So it'd be best if we could just remove all vehicle transactions and it's just personal transactions. Just my opinion.
So I guess I'll pose this as a question because I think what I heard is that there's a technology solution to not include that data, at least originally, or there's not. It does end up getting filtered into that individual, that customer's address. Go ahead,
Yeah, as
Michelle.
of right now.
So currently, they can do what's called a situs address for a vehicle. So if the vehicle is at their vacation home or is at their parents' house, they can say the vehicle is actually outside of DEQ. Doesn't change their permanent residential address, which is what the elections department uses. But currently, if you are changing your address for a vehicle transaction, it is changing your address for you specifically. There isn't, other than the situs address or the one-time address, if you're changing your address, you're changing your address. Like, I can't separate that. It is updating your profile in the system. Did I answer that accurately for
that was a
everybody to
good
understand?
clarification.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michelle, because I think that was getting to what Dina was talking about, where
Yeah.
there's no notification to them that yes, you put a different address because you're registering your vehicle or you have a desire to register your vehicle somewhere else. But if you're doing that away from your residence address, then you're updating your residence address with DMV, and therefore that would update it with the elections office and others potentially.
Yeah, it does that for you guys, but it also does it for law enforcement as well. right? Law enforcement uses our record as their source. And I also want to say that it's used by other departments and agencies as well, because we're the database, right? We're the database of where everybody is located.
Go ahead, Kat.
I did want to note that for online address updates, we do have the option. We let them select if they want this address to be excluded from voter registration. So that's present in that process. I know that with the vehicle transactions, that's just not, that language isn't there. But the other thing I'm thinking of is maybe, I don't know how much programming this would take on the tech side, but maybe there's a way when we do transfer data for us to get more specific about the origination of the address. Like maybe we could say, address update dealer, address update DMV customer online or something. That might be a possibility, just so you could, identify maybe an if then your process is okay, we want to take out these vehicle ones. Maybe that is a possibility, but we definitely can't change the fact that it updates the customer's profile at the moment.
Yeah, Tracy.
Yeah, exactly. It's the ones I think at the dealership that I'm more concerned with, because they don't realize that that has any bearing on changing their address. I know when I purchase vehicles, you just write your stuff down. Let's say I purchased one for my son and my son lives somewhere else, so I want it to go to him, but I'm responsible for it because he's not old enough or doesn't have the credit, whatever. I don't want my address to go there. So I'm just really concerned about the ones that are done at the dealerships, because I just assumed it was just for the vehicle and that was it. Not doing anything to me. It's just doing the vehicle. I understand the online one, yes, and it does ask you when you update something online if you want it to also go to DMV. I've seen it. It works great. But yeah, the dealership one has me a bit concerned.
So Tracy, I guess going to Kat's suggestion, if there was a way to identify the source, like the actual source of that data, would that be helpful information for you to be able to see DMV dealer services or counter, like field office?
Yeah, it would be. I think it would be like she also said, there's also different categories of addresses, but for the business ones, and sometimes those get input not correctly, and we end up with somebody trying to register at a business. Well, it's because they bought a vehicle, and it's just a mess. And it would be helpful for us to do either more follow-up with, or just to take a second look at before we make those changes.
Thank you for that input. Yeah, I guess I'm of agreement that the more information that we can include in the file, the more confidence our local election officials can have about the integrity of that data, and they would feel more confident processing that and maintaining those files. But it sounds like there might be a technical fix. And I guess before we continue into the weeds too much, like we'll get to the file transfer process in a couple weeks, where we can identify what are the data fields that need to be included in the data transfers. And so as we're having these discussions and thinking about that, I would ask you all to just remember where some of this stuff will live and where we will address it. Because yeah, if we're identifying things that information that we're not getting included in the data transfer, there'll be a place to add that in, or to at least offer that recommendation. Go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. In just going back to Kat, the online version that you said, a person has the opportunity to say, no, I don't want this used for voter registration purposes. And then Michelle, earlier you mentioned that you're updating your profile, your DMV profile with that address. So that's going to law enforcement and several other areas. just in the systems of systems lens that I'm looking through. If a person says, no, I don't want this address for my voter registration, I'm assuming there's logic built into the system that excludes that address from OMV, but for law enforcement purposes, that's where their registration address would be as well. I guess I just don't really understand, again, visual person, so understanding the real flow of data as it's entered and how it travels through the process would be really incredibly beneficial for promulgating these rules. And Tracy, and speaking to the point of identifying that this came from a vehicle dealership, understanding what that means from the county level. Oh, this record is inactivated. Oh, I see that this mailing came back as undeliverable. Oh, this came from a vehicle registration or a vehicle dealership registration. So that's going to allow me to take this one specific action that I wouldn't typically take for others. And that's because I know. So all of this is really incredibly important as we understand how it all plays out. But wondering if there's a way we're gonna make some recommendations and create some rules, but they're going to continue to evolve as we learn more and more about what these programs are and understand. There's just still a couple of questions out there for me where I'm like, oh, how does that affect that? Anyway, I think it's important to be able to see some examples of how OMV data is being collected and how it's kind of moving through the system. Thank you.
Yeah, so on that question, I guess I want to tease that out a little bit more for the if somebody's changing their address online, and they have that option box that appears saying, do you want to include this for voter registration? If they say no, then what's the effect? Because their record is still being updated. It sounds like the only effect is we're just not getting that data transferred to the elections office that day saying that there was an address change. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, so for us, knowing our processes, so we have the daily address change file, so it wouldn't show up in that we sent to Secretary of State. But you're right, we have other methods that that do update, check what we have on file, essentially. And it is, I would assume that the clerks would use it if they receive that information. For us, it's the HAVA file, but it would show up in the HAVA file because the HAVA takes a screenshot of our current database. So it is a problem that there's no notification or information to distinguish between those. They're given the opportunity for the daily address change, but not for our other practice that the customer has no idea is happening, that Secretary of State compares to the DMV system and sees if there's any updates that are available.
Thanks, Kat. I think that's helpful for us to understand, because as we're looking at the system and the changes that we can make, it sounds like we can remove some of the data streams, but we need to remember the complete downstream effects, that we can't change the fact that an individual only has one residence on file at DMV. And if they change that in one way, it's changed on their system. And so I think we can limit that initial transaction, that address change file that would come the next day. We can address that issue. But how do we address the downstream effects, where we're doing further comparison between DMV data and the voter file? Dina.
Thank you. If it's in the HAVA file and Eric is using the HAVA file, then the addresses changes getting to the counties anyway. So that's just that's exactly what Ann said, but just to be more specific for everyone to truly understand. Thank you so much for digging deeper into these things, because counties are still getting that information through other means and through other programs, and it's being used to update their records. So identifying ways to put some guardrails in place for those things is really important.
Go ahead, Tracy.
I just have to say, wow, I did not realize that Eric would pick that up and then send it to us. So yeah, that gives me a little heartburn for the voters.
So I'll acknowledge that heartburn, Tracy, and that's kind of what this process is for, is to help us all learn more about the different effects and to learn how we can start to address these. So I think that's a discussion, that's a different discussion that's out of the scope of this RAC, but it's helpful for us to know how that data is impacting the voter rolls through our partnership with Eric and that data processing. So I think that's more of a conversation that we could have with Eric on how they're treating their data. But if there is a way for us to delineate the difference of these sources, the source data, like this came from the individual, this came through a dealer, that extra information, I would imagine we could apply into our filters to make sure that we're not sending that on to the county election officials if possible. So all that to say, I appreciate the concerns there. And yeah, we'll have to address that in a different venue, I believe.
And just to add to that, and like, it's really important for all RAC members to understand the systems of systems that feed into OMV that are tied together. So what controls do we have through the rulemaking process? If we're adding a technical solution that we're identifying where data is coming from, that's one way to put some guardrails. If we are implementing a rule that a vehicle dealership are required to provide a handout potentially that explains the effect of updating your address at a vehicle dealership, what that looks like. If we're creating notifications when you're going through an online update for DMV that that a person is being educated about what the effect of changing your address is there. So that's the part that I'm was trying to dig into as we're talking about the system of systems and everything that's associated with it. Every change has an effect, and how can we address it with rule related to Oregon motor voter. So thank you. Really appreciate the conversation and digging in to one slide. We have so many slides left in this presentation, so I'm so glad that we have 3 meetings scheduled to discuss this very thing.
Michelle?
To add another complicated layer, there's other ways that we receive notification of address changes. One, for example, is when somebody's getting a handicap placard. So if they're getting a handicap placard from their doctor, they fill out their top information. If their address is changing, they select new, and then whoever is receiving that application, whether that's at headquarters or a field office, is going to update that address. So that form could be filled out by a relative, and then they're just signing because they're, functionally aren't able to fill out a form. That could be filled out by their doctor. So, but any notification of a new address that we receive, we have to take that as a notification of new address. There's no verification of that other than them marking the box and signing that that's their new address. So that's another piece that educating every source, it feels very daunting to me. We're not going to send out a letter to every single physician that can fill out this form or sign this form, right? Same thing would happen for people that hold commercial driver's licenses and they're doing their medical exam certificate. They can fill out this. When they fill that out, the address could be changed. So that could be chiropractors or out of state, or like the list is enormous as to who could potentially be giving us the information with the acknowledgement and consent of the customer.
Thank you for providing that extra information. And that's why this conversation is so helpful, because there's a lot of pieces that roll into this. Unfortunately, it's not super easy to do this as well as we would like it to function. So lots of different moving pieces that we need to be factoring into the rules. Just doing a time check because we see it's a quarter after. Yeah, I think we're okay to keep going. Any more discussion on address changes at this point?
I'll
think
just
we've
talk
got-
with our IS folks about how viable it would be to do, some sort of address source field or something like that. Because I know we can find it out when we look into it, typically where we got the address. So I'm thinking there's a possibility, but I'll try to have that before next week.
Thanks, Kat. That would be very helpful. Kyle.
Yeah, and if I can just offer from some other states, we've seen the importance of, we keep coming back to the daunting task of educating everyone who might be interacting with these forms. I think to Dina's point about seeing what these forms are and what the voter experience is, or what the driver experience may be when they're filling them out, would be a helpful and fruitful way to take this conversation. Like, we've just seen the importance of having clear instructions along with every checkbox, every form, every opportunity to enter address information, going a long way to avoiding these kinds of I'm still a little bit in shock thinking about the implication of, say, my grandmother applying for a disability placard and my dad filling it out and not knowing any better than to not change her address as he's doing so. So I think just to underline that as a point to come back to.
Yeah, thanks for chiming in. And I think we've had multiple of those moments where we've kind of discovered these specific circumstances that could happen, that could affect people's voter registration. And to again restate that challenge that we have is it's really hard to educate every single person that's interacting with DMV in the myriad of ways that they would be interacting with DMV to know how that information is impacting the other services that the state of Oregon provides them, including voter registration. So we've talked about the covered interactions that trigger the OMB process. We've also talked about a lot of the other opportunities that folks have to update their information, to change their address, and how that gets filtered down to us. Is there anything else from this process that y'all want to talk about today? What we've talked about last week, we talked about those folks that were specifically excluded from the process because they didn't provide all of the required information. Most of the time, that's referring to like a residence address or a signature. We've also talked a lot about the notification requirements or the notification recommendations. We spent a lot of time last week talking about just information that was being offered to individuals at DMV. Did anybody want to go back to that, to talk about those again? Okay. So we will still have another week to cover this particular module, the voter registration during covered transactions. So maybe what would be helpful here in the last 10 minutes of time that we have together would be what information could we provide in the next week that could inform our discussion further. I've heard talks about specific forms that we could look at and review, maybe screenshots of forms, Are there any other pieces of the puzzle that RAC members might be like, hey, actually, this would really help me understand this part of the process, or would provide additional information? Is there anything else that's outstanding at this point? Yeah, Tracy.
Yeah, I would like, I don't know how to say this. You say you run the addresses through a check. I think I would like to know a little more detail about that, because we still get addresses that are either incomplete or that really don't exist. And I know it's hard to do it at a state level. I mean, it's hard enough to keep track of them at a county level when they try to register at a place and you're like going, where the heck is this? I can handle the houseless population because they give a location, but when they give you an address and it comes through DMV and you're thinking it should be good and it's not, what are you getting? Where are you getting your information? I guess I want to see how that connects. Does that make sense?
So
Go
I
ahead,
can
Michelle.
answer that. So for example, our rural addresses are notorious for this, where U.S. Postal Service may not have the accurate address or an address in the system because it's a newer build or something to that effect. So when it's a first-time issuance or a renewal, we do need that verification that they have received mail, or they have like their mortgage statement that shows the address, right? So that is our main source of verifying that that is a physical address, of proof that, other businesses are accepting that as a physical address. In question is, what if the U.S. Postal Service doesn't acknowledge that as an accurate address? That is still entered into the system. Especially if they have a post office box or a separate mailing address, we would never have a way of verifying that that isn't an actual location. So I'm trying to take into account only like if they're doing a replacement driver's license and only using that address as their physical address, and they don't have a separate mailing address, essentially what would happen is they wouldn't receive their credential. And they would then have to come back in and get their issuance under a correct address that is actually something that they could get mailed to. So go ahead, Kat.
Oh, and I was just wondering, Tracy, you mentioned incomplete addresses. So I was wondering what that looks like on your end too. Like if it's apartment is missing, or what info is missing.
Yeah, usually it's an apartment or a unit or a space or whatever it is. It could be a room. Here in Astoria, people rent rooms, and we don't know unless they give it to us, of course. But I'm glad you clarified that a little bit on if they provide a mailing address, there really is no way to verify the address that they provided as a residence as being correct. So that gives me a little more to ponder and at least share.
So I want to specifically say that is if it also isn't verified under U.S. Postal Service, right? So there's a check mark that happens essentially that this is a verified address through U.S. Postal Service that happens. There are marks that, it won't mark that it's verified. But if that's what they're providing us, it is what they're providing us. As a field service worker, if they're providing it to me, it's not for me to argue with them that that is not an accurate address. If they're providing me proof that it's needed or it's not a requirement for the transaction, like a vehicle transaction or replacement driver's license, or they're giving it to a dealership, like I don't have a way of forcing verification, additional verification, I should say.
Dina?
Thank you. Back to Anne, what you were, you mentioned what would be helpful for the RAC in moving forward next week. And I think it would be really helpful if we can get from DMV a list of the sources that are used where address updates occur. Just a list of the sources. How does DMV receive information that's used to update the driver's profile or the identification holder's profile? Just knowing where those sources live. Understanding, getting back to the citizenship documentation, understanding where those identification types live, if it's in the manual, if it's in policy, if it's in rule. So revisiting that request so that we can tie to it. So both for qualifications, in order for us to successfully walk away from the next meeting with a good understanding of rules that we're going to promulgate associated with that, understanding the types of legal presence indicators that are used, where the identification document sources live, how frequently those are updated, kind of the policy decisions related to updating them. It would be helpful for us to tie those pieces and have a better understanding of those pieces, all kind of related to qualifications. Those are just a couple things to highlight before we end. Thank you.
And I see Kat nodding along because it feels like we're giving Kat some homework. So sources of documentation acceptable for citizenship, sources of information changes, address changes that are coming, like what are the DMV channels that we've identified, the technical option of including that data source in the transfer somewhere. Kat and am I missing anything else on your list?
I don't think so, but I'll go through my notes and make sure. And I'll send any clarifications to you all.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap up, to be respectful of everyone's time and to not go long. Thank you all for your participation this week. Again, next week will be our last week on this particular module on the voter registration during covered transactions at DMV. And then we'll move on to file transfers the week after that. So thank you all. Appreciate it. Again, if there's questions, there's the RAC inbox, the OMV RAC inbox that you can send to. And we'll look forward to continuing our discussion next week.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thanks, everyone.